lawyer, extraordinarily loyal NBA family member, and I applaud him and the COVID task force and the health law section of the NBA for participating and working together to bring together this magnificent panel. Mental health issues for lawyers and for our community are real. And I will just take a moment of personal privilege and share with you how all of us need to avail ourselves of all the resources in our community to ensure that we are addressing stress, anxiety, and things that happen to us, particularly as we struggle through COVID, police brutality, and election suppression. Those are the three pandemics that I've tackled this year. As a moment, just a word of personal privilege, I have teenage sons. One is 16 and one will be 18 next week. And they are learning virtually from home, but they do play sports. So they every day drive to school, which is about 20 minutes away. And both my boys, I only have two children, were driving to school, and they were stopped by the police. This happened a month ago. And I will tell you, with probably the three most difficult minutes of my life, I experienced, because at that moment they texted me and said, "Mommy, we're stopped by the police." And in my mind, in my heart, with all the work that I do, I recognized that there was a greater than 50% chance that both of my children would not survive that experience unscathed, and that they could not survive it. And so when I tell you it was three of the most difficult moments that I've experienced really in my life as an adult, it's real. The stress, the anxiety just posed by that one experience. Fortunately, I prayed to God. I said, "God, don't let this be my narrative. Don't let this be my narrative that I've lost my children by being stopped by the police." But I live in the Atlanta metropolitan area, and these things do happen. So I say to you, I share that very personal story with you all to say that for me, that was a moment of anxiety. I felt my heart stopped beating, and all of the education and training and all that I have flew out the window at that moment as I was confronted with the fear that something might happen to my only children. So, ladies and gentlemen, we have to deal with that. And I did make a call because I wanted to work through that. It paralyzed me for a moment in time, 3 minutes of what I would call sheer hell, in just praying for my children, for them to live, not praying for them to get to school safely and not get in an accident, but praying for them to live. And that's where we are in this country. So against that backdrop, thank you so much again, Marlon Primes, for this magnificent panel. I say to Dr. Angela Neal Barnett, who is a well-known author, thank you for what you are saying, what you're going to say, and all the information you impart. To Dr. David Jenkins, thank you so much for all that you do. It's important for people to see us in this dialogue, because we, in sharing our stories of how we get help, how we reach out, we can help maybe to turn around some of the devastating statistics that we see in our community where mental health or anxiety, it doesn't have to be where it progresses to a certain condition, but the day-to-day anxiety of where we're operating today is so real. So thank you. And thank you to all of those that put this together, and to our team at the National Bar Office. Thank you for always making us look good and making sure that we're on point.
Well, thank you, President C.K. Hoffler. It's certainly a pleasure to work with you this year. And I can tell you that President Hoffler has not only been a great leader for the National Bar Association, but she has a history of being a great leader. I had the pleasure of going to law school with her, and what you see now is what we saw so many years ago. Just a great leader, and more importantly, a great person. We have a wonderful webinar planned, and it's the first of a series of programs called our MBA Wellness Series that we're co-sponsoring with the MBA Health Law section. And today we have two outstanding speakers. Our first speaker is Dr. Angela Neal Barnett, that I've had the pleasure of knowing for many years. Dr. Angela received her PhD from DePaul University, and she is a professor at Kent State University. She is an author of a well-known book that Essence Jenkins magazine calls a must read. And the book is entitled Soothe Your Nerves, The Black Woman's Guide to Understanding and Overcoming Anxiety, Fear, and Panic. And Dr. Angela is also running the Kent State program research on anxiety disorders among African Americans. And most importantly, she is a proud parent of a 2020 college graduate. Welcome, Dr. Angela. Next, we have Dr. David Jenkins, who comes to us from the Federal Bureau of Investigation, where he's been an EAP counselor for the past 9 years. Prior to that, Dr. Dave worked in the U.S. Army as a medical technician. He retired from the U.S. Army after 20 years of wonderful service to our country. So welcome to Dr. David. And I will turn the microphone over to Dr. David, followed by Dr. Angela, and then we'll have a question and answer session for the last 20 minutes. So gather your questions online, and we'll try to get those to these wonderful speakers. Dr. David?
Outstanding. Thank you very much for that introduction. Let's see if we can go ahead and get my slides loaded up, and then I will continue to walk through those with us as we look at this together. So along the backdrop of working for the FBI, I wanted to be able to put out the disclaimer that while I work for the FBI, this presentation does not constitute an endorsement by the FBI. This comes from my education, my training, my background, and also you'll hear some of my bias that's put in there as well. So I too am a parent of 4 children. And I tell you, my 4 children have taught me a lot about the brain. So my children range in ages all the way from 25 down to 13. So we run the gamut of within our household of different age requirements. So let's go ahead and go to the next slide there. There are some general limitations that I'm going to talk about, and this is mostly an overview and an awareness. I will not cover every single situation, but that's why I'm going to leave room at the end so you all can ask questions. Write your questions down so that way we can tackle some of those things that I don't cover together. I'm going to talk a lot about the brain and the brain processes, but I want to try and oversimplify it, and so a way we can understand it together, and try not to get into a bunch of technical terms and labels of the brain, but more or less what's happening inside your head when we get stressed and we get overwhelmed, when we get anxious. You know, when we're, our children are being pulled over by the police officer, what's going on inside our head that causes us to freeze and causes our brain to regress. As I said, I won't cover every situation, but I'm going to give you an overview. Let's go ahead and go to the next slide. So as it turns out, in the brain, we have neurons. And so the neurons, they fire off, and that controls our brain functioning. So the neurons are connected to at least 10,000 other neurons next to it. And the neurons fire when they get stimulated. And you say, well, how do they fire? Well, they fire with electrical impulse, and they release a neurotransmitter. And that neurotransmitter goes over to the next neuron, and then you have a cascading of effects of neurons communicating with each other. So nerves are used to record data. They're used to process data, understand data, recall data, pull it back up, and then, at will be able to say, oh yes, I remember that. We pull it up. Now, when we are under stress and we're overwhelmed, we do not process information and data as smoothly as we normally would. Our neurotransmitters get interrupted. And so when we get overwhelmed, the neurotransmitters don't fire quite as much as they normally would. And then sometimes they overfire, such in the case of releasing too much dopamine. Then we get this feel-good feeling. Some stress, it's good. Think about the stress of getting a promotion. I love that kind of stress. Think about the stress of completing a task that was overwhelming. Feels good. Then again, sometimes we have some stress that is overwhelming to where it's just gnawing at us. Think about our children getting into a car accident. All of a sudden now we're tensed up. Think about when, the boss says, hey, I need to see you in my office. Now, I don't know about you all, but in the back of my mind, I'm wondering, okay, what did I do? Did I do everything right? Did I turn in something? What's going on? And then you get there and they say, hey, you got recommended for an award. And all of a sudden you're like, wow. But nonetheless, the stress is still overwhelming. Next slide, please. So it's within the brain, the nerves, they connect to one another. And as they begin to fire over and over again, they create a neural network. And so the neural networks, they are stimulated by different stimulus and activities. So for example, when I drive, if someone cuts me off in traffic, I have a neural network that automatically fires off immediately. I don't have to think about putting my foot on the brake because I've practiced that over and over again. My foot automatically slams on the brake with or without my permission. It just says, ooh, it's working correctly. So we have different neural codes and networks that call up different memories. I'll tell you, there's certain smells that when I smell, it just puts me back in the mind of being at my grandma's house. It's just like, that's home. And so a lot of us, we have different events that it stimulates a neural network. Now, some of us, we don't have to think about certain things. We have habits. And our neural networks, they fire off in the sequence and they create a habit. And we're able to pull it up without even any thought. Now, play with me for a moment. I'm going to give you an exercise and you tell me whether or not you can think about how this ends. Now, I know your mics are muted, that's okay, but I can only imagine how you're going to end this tune. So let me start with it. Dun, da, 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 da. Now, I can imagine you finishing it up inside your head saying, dun, dun. Now, the question that I have is, why did you finish it? How did you know how it ended? Well, you see, there's certain things that's been programmed in our brain over and over again. It just becomes autopilot. And even if I asked you not to finish it, you'd still have a difficult time and your brain would want to finish it anyway. That is the power of neural networks and habits. And some of us, we deal with stress that way. We come to a stressful situation and our brain automatically tenses up. It automatically locks up. It automatically gets anxious. That just happens to us over and over again. Not by conscious choice for many of us, but on autopilot. Next slide, please. So here I'm going to talk about the triune brain. We like to think of the brain as being a triune brain. And so if you were to put your hand on your forehead, right about there, it is the frontal neocortex. That particular part of the brain is what distinguishes us from other higher primates. It distinguishes us from other mammals. That particular part of the brain is our executive functioning. Now, incidentally, that part of the brain is also a slow thinking brain. It does not operate very fast. It likes to process information. It takes it all in. It considers all facts. It considers the details. And then it says, yes, this is the best way forward. So when you're in a stressful situation, that part of the brain goes offline. It does not function. As a matter of fact, it's a couple of steps behind. And so if you were to go right here on the top of your head, straight down inside, and where that yellow is on this particular slide, that right there, we like to nickname it the mammalian brain. So that mammalian brain is the limbic system. That limbic system goes on autopilot. That limbic system, it just kind of numbs out when we're overwhelmed, when we're stressed. It does what it's supposed to. This is the part of us that is very reactionary. If somebody says something to us and call us out of our name, oh my goodness, that part right there, if we're not careful, it will spout out something back. Now, if you will go down and you were to put your hand on the back of your neck, almost on the spinal cord, that right there, the red part, we like to nickname it the reptilian brain, but that is your brain stem. You see, when we're in survival mode, that right there says, keep breathing, keep this person alive, keep the heart beating. It will regulate your sleep. It will regulate your circadian rhythms. But when you're stressed and overwhelmed, fight, flight, or freeze. That particular part of the brain is very quick. Matter of fact, it doesn't require you to think. It reacts without your permission. And beyond popular belief, you don't have a choice of whether or not you fight, flight, or freeze. Your brain assesses the situation and says, this is a great time to faint. You know, when you're about to give a public speech, and you're talking to 5,000 people and you're getting overwhelmed and your hands are starting to sweat. This part of your brain, you have to fight against it to say, oh, no, 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 I'm going to remain in charge. You see, with the other parts of your brain, when you have good training, good habits, then you can overcome the fight, flight, or freeze. And Dr. Angela is going to talk a little bit later on about some of the things we can do to overcome that anxiety, maintain good, sense of self, and move forward, not succumb to the overwhelming effects of stress. In my experience, a lot of us, we think, when we experience stress, it's a sign of weakness. It is not a sign of weakness. It is your body's function to be able to help you survive a difficult situation. And over the years, the brain has devised different ways to help us survive. And it's passed that on through genetics. And it's passed that on to a way that says, this is the best way to move forward. Now, in our modern day, we have our mind. So we like to think our mind operates in the executive center. Our mind is our internal dialogue. Our mind is our decision making. Our mind is our ability to say, this is what I choose to do. This is what I want to do. Even though I know this is stressful, overwhelming, I'm going to do it anyway. But the problem is, when we get stressed, our brain regresses to a more primitive state. And our brain, the organ, wants to take over. So I often ask people, who's in charge of you? Your brain or your mind? Next slide, please. Now, if you keep your mind in charge and you stick with the mindfulness, this is where you can continue to make good decisions. As we look at this particular graphic here, this is a fictitious graphic that says different levels of functioning in the brain. And so I like to look at it as a way of 1 through 10. 10 being you are the most mindful person in the world. 1, you are regressed to survival. You are regressed to in a place of just trying to keep your head above water. But as you see everywhere in between, that right there represents different levels of regression. So while we're mindful way up at the top, you're pretty responsive, not reactive, but responsive. But most of us, as it turns out, vast majority of us, we operate on autopilot. Now, the autopilot comes from the limbic system. That means your brain goes on, zone out. I'll tell you, when I drive home, I admit, I can be in la la land driving and zoning, and all of a sudden I blink and I'm home, and then I think to myself, how did I get here? Oh my goodness, good thing I didn't get into a car accident. Well, it's because I've done it so many times that I'm thinking about other things. I'm zoned out and I'm on autopilot. Now, some of y'all, I know you go on autopilot the same, so much to the point where you probably miss your exit every once in a while. And you're saying, how did I do that? That happens to me too. But when you're down there on survival, so when you regress to the place of survival, that right there is the danger zone. That is the place to where we become overwhelmed. That is the place to where we can easily lose control of ourselves or lose control of our mouths or lose control of our body in the form of expressing it violently, throwing things, punching walls. I mean, some of the people that we work with, you can tell they were at a state of regression or whatever that they were involved with. Side note, once upon a lifetime ago, when I was in the U.S. Army, I spent 9 years working at Fort Leavenworth, which is the military's maximum security prison. I learned a lot about mental health working within the prison system. I learned a lot about the things that people do when they are overwhelmed and they are regressed. So part of my job at the prison was to assess who was a psychopath and who was not. So I got a chance to listen to a lot of stories that I just did not like to hear. At the end of the day, there were days that I would literally go home and just take a shower because of all the gunk that I heard. As it turns out, my caseload, it was full of child sex offenders and murderers. That was my caseload. And so in the Army, you don't get to volunteer with who you want to work with. There's a phrase we use in the Army called you are voluntold. And so a lot of things you have to endure and you have to do. Next slide, please. All right. So there are big changes, small changes. There's lots of things that begin to change your brain. And so as the neurons fire off, things such as trauma, hearing about traumatic events, witnessing a traumatic event, illnesses, different relationships that you're involved with, disappointments, all of these types of stressors can induce a regression. It affects the way your brain begins to fire. And so if your brain assesses, I need this reactivity really quick, and you haven't trained up for it, and you haven't prepared for it, and you don't know what to do next, your brain's autopilot will kick in. And then if you get to the place to where it's overwhelming you, your brain's reactivity center will kick in and you go into survival mode. This is where we regress to the brain stem. And the problem with the brain stem is when you regress to that particular place, it is difficult to encode new memory. This is why some people, when you say, hey, what happened? They say, I don't remember. And they'll look at you straight face and they don't remember because they weren't encoding new memories in their brain. I have a couple teenagers and I look at them and I'll say, what were you thinking? And they'll look back at me and, they give me this line, they'll say, I don't know. And in all reality, they don't know what they were thinking, which is the sad thing. But the way the brain operates, if you do that over and over again, that becomes your programming. And so there are some people that are chronically regressed. There are some people, rather than having an acute regression, such as something that happened really quick, they have a chronic steady state regression. And so they get stuck at a place of, operating from a more primitive part of their brain. And it's interesting because there's some people that you would think they would be higher functioning than what they are. I mean, believe me, there are some people that are so regressed, they can run corporations. Matter of fact, there's some people that are regressed that can even run countries. Regression is not a matter of intelligence. It's where do you operate from at in your brain and how reactive you become, whether or not you're having higher level of functioning or whether or not that you can think clear. Next slide, please. So as it turns out, regression is a brain state. It is a state of where your brain is. It is not a matter of intelligence. And so I like to always help people understand a little bit more about the brain. So we're going to divide the brain as in two hemispheres. So, you have a left hemisphere and a right hemisphere. So generally speaking, while there's crossover, but I'm going to speak in stereotypes here. Generally speaking, the left side of your brain, we like to think of it as the logical center. This is where we have those higher thoughts. This is where we can go through things and think rationally. And many of us, we like to think of our left brain as superior. Well, it's not always the case because the left brain is also influenced heavily by the right side of the brain. The right side of the brain, very emotional, very reactive. The right side of the brain is where we have outbursts. The right side is usually dominated by visual stimuli, whereas the left brain, it's dominated by auditory stimuli. The left brain also dominates during the day. Now, what do you think dominates at night? You guessed it, the right side of the brain. And this is why some of us, when we are stressed and overwhelmed and when we regress, we have a hard time sleeping. We have a hard time with nightmares. We wake up and all of a sudden it's like, man, I felt like I didn't sleep at all. That's because the different parts of the brain dominate at different time periods. Now, if I'm stressed and overwhelmed, the left side, it might have more foggy thinking. I'm a coffee drinker, but I just enjoy coffee. But those of you out there that drink coffee, you might be able to relate to this. It's that feeling of fog that you get in your brain right before you have that first morning cup of coffee. You're just like, oh man. And some people, they operate that way chronically. Next slide, please. So this is a very busy graphic. Now, I made this particular graphic a standalone PDF file, so this is available to some of you all if you wish to take a look at it further. But I wanted to be able to use the Mariana Trench model of regression so you can be able to understand. If you look at the side where it says chronic regression, acute, and then the other side on the left side, it says steady state regression, acute. So those give you a representation of the steady state regression and the acute regressions. Now, the Mariana Trench, some of you all may recall, the Mariana Trench is the deepest part of the ocean. It is out near the Mariana Islands. Now, The normal part of the ocean is generally about 2 miles deep. The Mariana Trench, almost 7 miles deep. Now, you can imagine the amount of pressure being that far down in the ocean. Now, I must tell you, being that far down in the ocean, there are actually fish that live that far down in the ocean, and there are some ugly fish that live there. But can you imagine the amount of pressure that is on top of those fish that live in that part of the ocean? When we get stressed, overwhelmed, and regress, sometimes we feel like we are under that much pressure. Sometimes we feel like we are down at the bottom of the Mariana Trench. Being that far down, some of us have the way our brain begins to function, we regress to the point to where we withdraw from others. We get angry, we get snappy. We start using regressive words like never, always, should. If you ever use that kind of language like people should, or I never, or I can't believe you always, that's a good indication your brain is operating on a regress state. Now, some of us, when we regress, we're easily confused. Some of us, when we regress, we become sarcastic. Sarcasm, by the way, many people say, well, that's a higher level of functioning. Actually, sarcasm is anger that leaks out, and it's very biting. Sarcasm can be very cruel, and it's our way of lashing out. And you give a double message when you use sarcasm. One, you have to map out whether or not another person can track your sarcasm. And two, you have to map out whether or not they're going to get the hidden message. So sarcasm, you get a double whammy. So as you look at this scale here, you'll see the different mile markers. The further down you go, the more in survival you go. The further up you go, the more humble you can become. Calm, stable. You have a good solid sense of self. You're able to develop collaborative alliances. But the sad reality is research tells us that most people, they're not there. Most people, they operate on a regress state. There is also one other thing I need to warn you about regression. Regression is very contagious. I mean, when one person regresses, watch out. Other people are going to regress with them. Think about it. When somebody says something to you, now you get defensive. Now you say something back. Now it goes back and forth. And so you can watch regression take over. And it's almost like a stampede. We begin to operate like a herd. But when we're in a steady state regression, we're also very resentful. We also become very controlling. There are gaps in our mental radar. We can't quite see everything. Those dotted lines that you see on this particular graph, they represent the further down you go, the less options you perceive you have. The further up you go, the more options that you have to problem solve. And so as you begin to elevate your functioning or deal with your stress, that in itself helps you deal with regression quite a little bit better. So let's go to the next slide. So one of the greatest things you have to do is be able to recognize your own regression. What does your regression look like? I'll tell you, I know when I regress. When I regress, I start grinding my teeth at night. When I regress, I get snappy. When I regress, my kids, they say, Dad, you all right? You got this 1,000-mile stare. It's because I'm zoned out. So you have to begin to look at, what does your regression look like? And then how do you begin to change that? Here is the baseline that I tell people to do. Here's what you say to yourself. Until proven otherwise, I must be regressed. Now, most of us can recognize a crisis, an acute regression, but it's hard to recognize that steady state regression. So this is the exercise for you to begin to challenge yourself. Start asking, am I regressed? And if you recognize a regression, this is where you begin to slow down, breathe, become mindful, calm your heart, and then quiet your mind. Whenever I've experienced it too, where my kids have been pulled over, and as many of us, and your heart is up here, you're overwhelmed. It's like, oh, what can I do? And you're feeling helpless. One of the things that you can do, well, what I do oftentimes is pray. I calm my heart and quiet my mind, and I begin to ground myself to say, while I am overwhelmed, I have no control at the moment, but here's what I can control. And then you get a hold of yourself to where then when you are able to function, when you are able to intervene, you are at sound mind. Next slide, please. All right, here's a quote that I want you to be able to become aware of. The best of me It acknowledges the worst of me. However, the worst of me, it denies its own existence. You see, if I don't recognize the worst part of me, I'm blind to it. I just continue on. But if I can at least see the worst part of me, the best of me is capable of standing up. Next slide. All right, these are some references here. So if you request my slide, these are where some of the information that comes for neurobiological functioning, so you can learn more about the brain. This is a very quick overview. I do understand that, do recognize that. So I don't expect you to memorize it. But however, if you find you have an interest, there are these books are available to you. And so what I want to do now is turn over my time to Dr. Angela, so that way we can be prepared for you all toward the end to answer your questions. Dr. Angela, it's over to you.
Thank you, Dr. Dave, and thank you for sharing about stress, and that stress does start in the brain. I'm Dr. Angela Neal Barnett. Everybody calls me Dr. Angela, and I am so excited to be here today to really talk about soothing your nerves, and particularly soothing your nerves in these unprecedented times. And I understand I'm using my therapist voice, so I'm going to, you were using yours, Dr. Day, so I am going to increase my volume, so I'm using my professor voice here. Okay, so we are experiencing stress, anxiety, fear, trauma in unprecedented times. We are in COVID-19, and in the midst of COVID-19, racism emerged as a public health crisis. And in a non-COVID world, racism is a stressor. We know it's there, okay? We experience it on a daily basis, but we know how to manage it, okay? But what has happened is we've got COVID-19, the isolation, the loss of jobs, the loss of seeing, the loss of going into work, and then on almost a daily basis, we are seeing Black men and women harmed, killed, and murdered. And so, and if you just pull up my slides, please, or do you want me to share screen? Okay, all righty. And can we take this into preservation? And so, in the midst of all of this, one fact comes true. Next slide, please. It is literally exhausting to be Black in this country. How many of you have said almost every day, it's exhausting to be Black in this country? And even when you want to go and relax, like watching the NBA playoffs and finals, where you see Charles and Kenny and even Shaq saying, it's literally exhausting to be Black in this country. So in these unprecedented times, with these dual chronic stressors, we are exhausted. And adding to that exhaustion is the fact that many of us, somebody just said, it's the reason for our shorter lifespan. And actually, the biological data says it is indeed. If I was to, and so I'm going to pivot a little bit and say, if I was to do a prick the finger of everyone who is listening today, and then smear it, and then look at the end of your cell, of the end of your DNA, I would find that the end of your DNA strand was shortened, which is a measure of cellular aging. Okay. The dual pandemics are literally not only exhausting, but literally killing us as Black Americans. And then many of us, one of the reasons we join NBA is not only because of camaraderie and because of how NBA really speaks to our needs, but many of us are onlys. So the only way we get to see somebody else who looks like us on a daily basis is when we connect with our NBA colleagues, both in the city, wherever we are, or on a national basis. So we are onlys. So combine that with the dual pandemic, the unprecedented times, being an only, and then how people see us. So I could spend the whole time talking about how we are perceived as Black onlys, but I wanted to just give two examples. So the next slide, please. Okay. So if we are African-American males, and many of you may recognize this as the cover of Vogue a couple of years back, where we had LeBron and Giselle, and how this cover whether it was intentional or non-intentional, mirrored the cover of King Kong, the first King Kong movie. So we've got this, it says, destroy the mad brute. So many of us, even though it's the furtive thing from what we are, as Black males, we are seen as angry and scary and criminal. CJ talked about her sons being pulled over and the fear that she experienced in that moment. Because when they were pulled over, she knew, and we all knew, that they weren't seeing two high school boys on their way to school. They were seeing this image, this stereotype of the angry, scary Black male. But Black males aren't the only ones who are scary. Next slide, please. Yeah, okay. Black females. Angry Black females, okay. Angry Black women. And when you're an only, how many of you as Black women have had to correct someone? Or have had to speak up for yourself? And all of a sudden then, you may have gone from office pet to office threat. The angry Black woman. There are many, many other images, but in the interest of time, I just wanted to show us the angry ones. Okay. The point being here is these images that our colleagues have of us, these images that we may have of ourselves, coupled with these unprecedented times, the chronic stress of racism, the chronic stress of COVID, leads us to be exhausted. And that exhaustion then takes several forms of anxiety. Can we go to the next one? Okay, so I want us to become familiar with two terms, fear and anxiety. They are cousins, because everybody has a cousin, right? But they are not the same thing. Okay, fear is experienced in the face of an immediate threat. CJ's sons in the car with the police officer texting her, "Mom, we just got pulled over." Your fear went into overdrive, not to even say what happened to her son's level of fear. Okay. People say a very popular meme is that fear is anxiety. Fear is fantasy expecting a reality. But in the dual pandemic world, as Black Americans, as Black attorneys, as Black lawyers, there is nothing fantasy about our fear. What is fantastic is that we continue to function in the face of the fear that is around us. Anxiety is fear's cousin. And anxiety is what happens, and not in the face of something, but when we expect something to happen. So this perception that something is going to happen. Okay, we don't know what, and we don't know when, but we know it's going to happen. And that then puts us in this stage or place of hypervigilance. And psychologists like big words, and I believe attorneys do too. But what we're really talking about is we are in the state of highest alert. So what may have happened after the incident that CJ described to us in the beginning is now every time those boys leave for school, you're saying a prayer and you're hoping beyond hope that they do not get pulled over. So the fear has been replaced by this anxiety. What if this happens? What if that happens? What if this happens? This perception that something is going to happen to the sons. And let me say that anxiety is felt by every Black mother, by every Black father who has a son. All of us have the same fear. And that all of us have the same fear, which creates this state of anxiety that we feel we are perpetually in. So, fear, immediate, this is what happened. Anxiety, the state of highest alert, because we think something is going to happen. And fear, in our cases, as Black Americans, breeds anxiety. Next, please. So, what type of anxiety are we experiencing? Okay. And the most common form is panic attacks. So panic attacks occur in 3 ways. All of a sudden, out of the blue, for no reason at all, you just feel really, really scared, really, really anxious. and things start to happen in your body. You go from cold to hot, hot to cold. Your arms or your legs might start to feel numb. Your heart starts beating really fast. You have trouble breathing. You think you're going crazy. You think you're going to die. And in many cases, you may end up in the emergency room or in the telehealth situation saying, I'm having a heart attack. And they assess and they say, you're not having a heart attack. It's just stress. Go home and relax. And you think, or you say out loud, relax? How in the world am I supposed to do that? But it's not stress. It is a panic attack, which is a form of anxiety. The second type of panic attack is that something has happened, okay, and we experience this physical experience, we have this physical reaction to what had happened, and now in that state of hypervigilance, we continue to think it's going to happen, and we have this panic attack. So for those of us who are worried about our sons, and those of us who have daughters who are worried about our daughters being out and being pulled over, they're out and they're like 5 minutes late. All of a sudden, we might start shaking. Our heart might start beating faster. We might go from cold to hot, hot to cold. We might have a panic attack. And to make it even worse then, anytime we start to feel those symptoms, we think we're having a panic attack. So racism as a chronic stressor, COVID as a chronic stressor has increased the number of panic attacks being experienced by Black Americans. And then the final type of panic attack happens at night. And most panic attacks happen at night. And just as you're falling asleep and just as you're waking up, you feel as if you can't move. And then you might start to see things and you bolt up and you start to panic. If you're from the South or if you were raised in the South, this might sound kind of familiar, something people call the witch was riding me or a hate got a hold of me. But this is actually a form of panic. And it is called, the really nice psychological name is isolated sleep paralysis. And most people have that experience once, but among Black Americans, it happens over and over again. Next slide, please. The other form that I want to talk about, because many of us are experiencing it, is social anxiety. And again, we're experiencing this much more because of these dual pandemics. So, how many of you, the weekend that the George Floyd video was released, received emails from colleagues asking you where the brief was or where the work was that you promised? How many of you went into work or virtually turned on your computer that Monday morning and nobody said a gosh darn word to you about what we had all witnessed? So you're sitting there and you're thinking, what is wrong with these people? And given the stress, given the level of anxiety, You may have said something. Not that they didn't deserve it, but you could have said it a little differently. So our social anxiety is at an all-time high because we're worried about what must other people think, or what if this happens and I say this? What if that happens and I do this? So social anxiety is what must other people think, and a whole bunch of what ifs. And as I've said before, many of us are experiencing some form of social anxiety in these dual pandemics. Full disclosure, whenever I go in to a meeting now, a virtual meeting at work, I have to write down what I want to say, because I just don't want to say something that is going to trigger me and trigger the people I am in the meeting with, the people who are not Black who I am in the meeting with. All right. The last thing I want to talk about, because we've got anxiety, but this exhaustion, and remember, stress, anxiety begin in the brain. And the last thing I want to talk about is trauma. Next slide, please. Okay. Because over and over and over again, we as Black Americans are being traumatized. Racism is a stressor. It's a chronic stressor. But look at how far we've all come. We're partners. We're senior in our firms. We're deans. We're professors. We're on our own businesses, our own practices. So we have learned to manage racism as a stressor. But over the last 6 months, with that knee to George Floyd's neck, racism shifted from being a stressor to trauma. And it is that trauma that we continue to see over and over and over again that victimizes and re-victimizes us. So some of us are numb. Some of us can't unsee certain videos. Some of us are thinking that there is no hope, and we are feeling helpless and a little bit of worthlessness. And when we are feeling that, that places us at high risk for thinking maybe we would be better off not being here. So we've got this trauma, numbness, the insomnia, and then the thinking. And so I do want to say this, that if you are thinking that you will not be better off here, I just want to give you a number. If you know somebody who's thinking this way, who's been traumatized over and over again in these last 6 to 8 months. And again, we keep seeing, it's not like this is a one-time occurrence. It's as if every weekend, some sort of information or video emerges of some other unarmed Black male or female being killed. So if you're thinking this, I want to give you this number. And this is a number where you can talk to someone who is culturally competent, who understands that Okay, it is literally exhausting being Black in this country. And who will not ask you, well, tell me again how racism works? And that number is this, 1-800-273-8255. So I'm going to say it again, and I hope somebody puts it in the chat, 1-800-273-8255. And we hear, again, trauma after trauma after trauma, resulting in the constant victimization of Black Americans. How do we heal? You know, how do we go from anxious, panic attack, social anxiety, traumatized Black Americans to Black Americans who are healing? Next slide, please. Okay, so first of all, we have to give ourselves grace. You know, we're Black. So, you know, we're supposed to, you know, we talk about angry Black men, angry, scary Black men, angry Black women, but also we've been taught to be strong and that we should be able to handle anything. And plus many of us are only, so we've proven we can handle anything, okay? It is okay to not be okay. And we need to give ourselves the grace to say, I'm not doing okay, and that doesn't mean you're going to take away my Black card. Okay. There is no sin and no shame in needing help. Where the sin and the shame comes is when we know we need help and we pretend like we don't. Peace. Peace comes when we ask for the help and we go for the help, okay? So peace comes in doing therapy or doing counseling. And, you know, people sometimes have this stereotype of therapy that you'll be there for like a year, 2 years, etc. Most people spend 4 to 6 sessions in therapy and counseling. It's that quick. It's that quick. And then understanding, grace, peace, and understanding. And part of the understanding is coming from today, but also understanding that some of these things I talked about, the videos that we see over and over again, are triggers, that always having our phone in our hands create a sense of unease and unrest for us. And understanding that we are not alone, that collectively, as a people, we are going through this together. And as one of us steps forward and says, I need help, more of us will step forward and collectively we will heal. I'm going to open it up for questions for Dr. Dave and I at this point.
Well, thank you, Dr. Dave and Dr. Angela, for a wonderful presentation today. We have a number of comments in the chat about getting your slides, and so we'll see if we can make those available, Dr. Dave's slides and Dr. Angela's slides. We talked about different methods for dealing with stress in terms of mindfulness and breathing. Are there any other resources or techniques that both of you may recommend in terms of dealing with stress and maintaining your mental health in the COVID era?
Well, I'll go first. I think one of the most important things is how we greet the day. Um, and right now, many of us, if we're rolling out of bed and getting dressed, most of us, are greeting the day in very, very stressful ways. And so it's so important that we take at least 10 minutes first thing in the morning to just do something that allows us to greet the day in a positive way, whether that be journaling and a gratitude journal. No, I'm so glad I'm so glad for my daughter. I'm glad for this. Whether that be prayer, as Dr. Dave has mentioned, whether that be yoga, whether that be something as simple as sitting and drinking a cup of tea in the morning before we wake anybody else up. And notice that I said tea, and hopefully decaffeinated tea or herbal tea, because one of the things that we know is that caffeine actually makes you more anxious. And so you want to stay away from the caffeine in the morning. Dr. Dave?
Thank you. I echo those totally. And basically, having a good, healthy lifestyle. One of the things that we leave out is physical fitness. And one of the things about physical fitness, I'll talk about it from a neurobiological perspective. As I mentioned, left and right hemispheres, there is a brain hack that we can take advantage of. When we walk, or when we run, or when we exercise, we use bilateral movement. And so the neural pathways between the two hemispheres, they are open to us when you can begin to think and problem solve. This is why whenever you get stuck on a problem and you're sitting down and you say, doggone it, and you get up and you go and you walk away, you have the aha moment. You go, oh yeah, it's because you're hijacking those neural pathways. And so I encourage folks to exercise, have a good, healthy lifestyle, and to continue to stretch. That's one of the greatest things that we can do throughout our adulthood in order to maintain good brain health. And so the other things, connect with other people. Have those good social networks to where you can have someone that you can count on to say, hey, can we just talk? I don't need you to say anything. I just need to vent. I just need to talk. And so sometimes having that sense of validation where you're heard, and someone can give you feedback to say, hey, yeah, I've been there. And then sometimes people in my life, they'll give me the feedback to say, come on now, pull it together. And that's what I need at that moment. So I encourage us to, as a whole, to develop those healthy lifestyles to where we can maintain good functioning and ways to reduce stress as well.
We have a great question in the chat from Chrysaria Houston. As many of you may know, there's a sort of the old advice that many of us have perhaps received about just shouldering on. Your grandparents dealt with more, and as a result of that mindset, many of us are reluctant to seek mental health counseling. And the question is, how do we get rid of that stigma, especially in the African American community, before a crisis spirals out of control?
Um, this is what I will. This is what I will say. We're told to keep praying, toiling on. This is not our grandparents' world. Um, and with social media, with everything that is going on, we truly do believe uh, that it is a sign of weakness to seek help. But there is nothing weak about that. And while we think we're doing well, uh, everybody else can see that we are not. And so it becomes important for us to break through that stigma of the strong Black woman, of the strong Black male, And even if you don't want to do it in terms of individual, because that's scary to many people, groups and things that are indigenous to Black culture. So there are groups that are down at barber shops now, and there are sister circles that are available. And there are people out there who are culturally competent. They're Black therapists like Dr. Dave and I, but there are also people who are culturally competent. And so I would encourage, if you're feeling like, if I do this, I've broken the Black code, um, to do it. First of all, start with a group. And um, there are places that can get you in touch with groups in your city. One is the Anxiety and Depression Association of America. Another is the Association of Black Psychologists, the Association of Christian Counselors, Dr. Dave Letmore. So start with a group. And I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Dave, and I have something else I want to say.
I definitely agree with that. And so I often challenge folks because we like to suffer in silence and we don't have to. Whereas in the day of our grandparents, many of them still took advantage of their ministers. And so they may not have told you. Many of also our grandparents took advantage of consulting with their grandparents. So there was always someone within the Black community that we could go to talk to. Whether or not they were professional, that was beside the point, but there was always someone where we could lean on as a people. So today, culturally, we're spread out. Today, culturally, we don't necessarily have that familiar connection within the same community. They might be a couple communities over. You can't just pop in on grandma. So I always tell folks, take advantage of those folks that are competent to be able to help you, to where you don't have to continue to endure, but you can also continue to heal. And as a people, I would say, and I have said this many times, we are very resilient, to where once you give us the tools, we take full advantage. And so in order to use tools, you have to go to the right source. So a lot of us think, oh man, it's a sign of weakness. The only sign of weakness is when we ignore, because then we further erode our brain functioning. However, as in my quote earlier, it's the best of me that can recognize, ooh, I need help. And then you can have that ability to stand up. So if you can't trust someone right away, I have a quote that I often share with my kids. Trust is overrated. Trust later. Go get help. And then you can start trusting. We like to practice impression management. So I encourage folks to give up trying to manage someone else's impression of your Blackness, but begin to become whole first. Then you can operate from a place of integrity and authenticity.
Okay, great. Those are great questions. And perhaps what we can do on our COVID page on the MBA website is put out the information that you all suggested to try to help us find counselors that are culturally competent.
And Marlon, there are other places as well. I mean, there are apps now, therapy for
Okay.
Black girls, therapy for Black men.
Yes.
They're also, there is no reason why anyone cannot find a culturally competent therapist. And I saw in the chat something about sometimes ministers are the problem. And sometimes they are, because, they think, if you just pray a little harder, follow the Bible, you won't need a psychologist. But again, that's incorrect. And even in those churches, you really do see people doing counseling. And there are people, there's the wise, they're the old saints of the church, who really do know what they're doing. They're not trained or anything like that, but they're wise. And oftentimes in their wisdom, what they're telling you to do is seek more, seek help.
Those are great advice. Um, and oftentimes, not only in the ministry, but also in the legal profession, we're called upon to go outside our bandwidth and provide counseling. What sort of tips would you both give in terms of just guidance for us as legal professionals, in terms of, whether a problem is more complex and professional assistance is needed for a colleague, for a friend, for a family member, or yourself?
I'll jump on this one first. One of the things that I would often tell folks to do is have a list of resources to hand out when you recognize something is beyond your scope. But don't be afraid to ask, hey, is everything okay? Are you having any thoughts that scare you? What else is going on? So asking those questions and sometimes being very direct is the best thing that we can do. A question within the Bureau, what we're training our agents to be able to do is ask, are you having any thoughts of harming yourself? And then being prepared for the answer. Most of us think, oh man, I don't want to put that idea in someone's head. It's already there. We're just going to validate. And when you can bring it up to the forefront to at least ask, then folks can say, okay, then I do need to get help. I must. So if someone else is seeing this in me, let me go to that next step. And when you have those resources available to provide them to say, hey, I have a list of people that you might want to check out, that you can talk to, that also conveys caring. Follow up is also important. Hey, did you go check out those people? I don't want to get all into your business, but I just want to make sure you're being taken care of.
And maybe a correlate to that question is, how do we recognize that in our children, or also our retirees that are more isolated now because of COVID? What sort of warning signs should we be looking for, and what sort of action should be taken, if any?
Some of the warning signs that we may see is just general depression, withdrawal. I don't want to associate. I don't want to talk. And sometimes it comes out as anxiety as well, that irritability. It's just that leave me alone. Being able to ask a little further rather than just ignore it and brush it off. So often we are trained to give people their privacy, and we don't want to, intrude. But I encourage, go to that next, step, because sometimes people just need you to, see them, and letting folks know you see them. Some of the extreme, well, the extreme are, self-harm behaviors. Rather than ignoring those, taking action and asking about them. I don't know, I'm gonna toss it over to Dr. Angela, because I know she had some things that she was getting ready to say as well.
Yeah, one of the things I think you want to also look at, and again, because we're in COVID, but if they're sleeping more, or if they're not sleeping, sleeping more or not sleeping, if you're seeing them eating more or eating less, those are things, particularly with the retirees, the older, the senior generation. What you really want to do is you want to check in on them. I mean, at least once a week, if not twice a week. Somehow check in on them, but particularly for the kids, the irritability and the sleeping issue is a really big one.
Also, to piggyback on that, is the change of alcohol use,
Yeah.
whether it be a significant increase. One of the things I recently read in is that those that retire have an increase of alcohol use up to 30%. And so when I have folks that retire from the Bureau, I generally remind them and then have an accountability partner, what's going to happen if that goes beyond that. But family members, if we notice, hey, you've had a little bit more than you normally would, it's just something to take note of. Not to say that in itself is, huge, but that with everything else, with COVID, with isolation, with being left alone, okay, now you have additional red flags to say, I can't just ignore this one, but to go a little further. The one other thing I'd like to put out there, you had mentioned elderly folks. Sometimes the use of technology is also helpful. Whether it be you checking in on folks through Alexa, or whether it be Google, or whether you have the different movement things in the house to let you know if an elderly parent has fallen, or they're up and moving, or wait a minute, they're not getting around anymore. It's an additional tool, not the only thing, but an additional tool to investigate. my house, we have one child that's disabled. And so we use technology quite frequently to help us help him. And in doing so, we've learned a lot about just there are some folks that can withdraw and you never know it because they really don't go out anyway. But technology helps us to maintain a pulse on things.
One of the things that we also want to address is, you talked about the different tips in terms of what we should recognize in our children and our elderly. But one of the issues that's come up in the COVID world is, and also as it relates to George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, there have been meetings at work and discussions, and that can cause a whole group of stressors for those of us that might be the only one on the job. Can you give us any tips in terms of navigating that space, in terms of, participating in meetings or telling what you really think? That can provide stressors as well, and perhaps it can provide some relief too. How do you balance that as a counselor? What advice would you give us?
Well, I do not believe at this point that any of us, uh, I do not believe that any of us are in the space to tell white folks what to do. I think at this point it becomes incumbent upon white folks who say they are our allies to begin to talk to other people who look like them. And this is a view that's espoused by many, many in the field because the constant re-victimization makes that difficult. In terms of talking about, tell us what you really feel. Right now, my recommendation has always been that within firms, within corporations, uh, your black attorneys, your black employees need a safe space to talk, and they need a space where there are not people, or where there are not non-blacks. That part is going to come. Uh, but in the healing process, we have to heal first, ourselves first, before we can begin to say, how do we make this better for the firm? How do we make this better for the office, etc.? It's, I mean, these are unprecedented times. And people will say, well, I don't want to do that. If we do that, aren't we segregating, or aren't we, won't other people get mad? But again, what we know psychologically is that self healing has to take place first.
Absolutely. I definitely echo that. And so the recommendation I, constantly tell people is we can only take people as far as we've gone. And so until we've done our own work, and there will be varying people at different levels of their own work. Some started well before George Floyd.
Yeah.
Some started at, after George Floyd. Some have not even looked at starting, their own healing of trauma and their background. And so the question was, what do we do in a workplace that looks to us and we're the only, sometimes giving up impression management, sometimes giving up managing everyone else's impression of you of being the Black person at work. That's very difficult to do because sometimes we feel that pressure. And I often tell people when you're solid, you get to that place of realizing, that's not a conversation I'm ready to have right now. Or you get to that place that says, how about a conversation at another time? Or let me collect my thoughts. Or how about we outsource that one? Right? It's just recognizing where you're at in that process and realizing you do not have to be the Black ambassador for all the other white folks in the office. And while they may look to you and say, hey, you don't have to take on that burden. Additionally, that's like living at the bottom of the Mariana Trench. It will keep you regressed because you'll feel that pressure. Functioning is, I need to collect my own thoughts. And self-awareness is, I might not be at a good space to tell you. And that's hard to do because we, being at the top of our game, we like to have all the answers. I'm speaking for myself as well, but recognizing I've met my limitation. And that's okay too.
And I just want to underscore something Dr. Dave said. it is a burden, and it is not our burden to bear right
Yeah. Yeah. I think someone had something in the chat box there.
now.
And it was down at the bottom. I was just trying to read through it, and they said, "How do you get therapy, or does it work for those that don't want it?" It's hard to pressure somebody into getting help. However, when you model a good lifestyle, when you model good healing, people begin to ask, "There's something up about you." And then you could tell folks, yes, these are some of the tools that work for me. I might not say, here's therapy, but I'll say, here's some tools, and then begin to get people interested to say, and if you want to learn more, yeah, I'll tell you. However, if we don't model good behavior, we can only take people as far as we've gone. We don't become that where people can say, I see that works for you. Sometimes some of us, we're in the middle of our therapeutic process and we're still struggling through, and other people see that. That's okay too. But begin to be available. Can you force therapy on people? No, I learned that working in prison. We use lots of incentives to incentivize therapy, but it only works when people begin to recognize for themselves this is what they need to do.
Okay, we have about 8 minutes left, and maybe what I'll do is just turn it over to each of you all for your perhaps final thoughts, and we'll see if there's any additional questions that anybody has in the interim.
Dr. I was going to say, go for it. So my final thoughts, get to the place to where you can heal, take care of yourselves. Also begin to reach out for those that you love and help them find resources so they can begin to take care of themselves. I'm gonna give you my bias. My bias is we each heal individually. We are very resilient, but if we can provide a pathway for others to also begin to heal, that's how we can continue to multiply that healing and that moving forward, rather than remaining in a victim status, rather than being re-victimized, but getting to that place to where I can say, I'm gonna take charge of my life. I'm gonna move forward this way. It's tough because along our healing path, I wish I could say it is a straight linear path. It is full of ups and downs. It's full of disappointments. And I often encourage folks to continue to do it anyway. Even through anxiety, there's where we begin to develop anxiety tolerance, and strategies to say, okay, I often like to think of it as, I'm gonna use an analogy. Think about when you first started riding a bicycle, the amount of anxiety of trying to balance a bicycle. You're balancing opposing forces that says you're going to fall, but along the way, you figure out and you settle into the anxiety of riding the bike. Now, most of us as adults, if we ride a bike, we don't even think about it, that initial anxiety. We go on and we do what we need to do. Now, along the way, if I were to ask you as an adult, how do you put yourself out there to learn to ride a unicycle? Well, again, full of anxiety, full of balance, but after enough practice, we settle into it. Healing is the same way. As we go back and we readdress some of the things from our past that kept us stuck, some of the previous things that we grew up with, some of our previous traumas. And sometimes it's not even our traumas, it's our parents and our grandparents' traumas that is thrusted on us. We have to heal from that too.
Hey,
I,
Dr. Angela?
I would just say it's so important that you to understand that you are not alone. Every Black person in this country is experiencing some form of anxiety, fear, or depression. It comes with these dual pandemics. And so I would just also say that there are three things I want you to understand, and we have that side: giving yourself grace, peace, and understanding.
Amen. Now, one of the things, just in following up, you indicated there are a number of other African American organizations that are of counselors and those that can provide assistance. Do they have affiliate chapters around the country, or is there a list in terms of where these particular organizations are located outside of the nation's capital, which I'm assuming would be their headquarters?
So of the organizations I'm thinking of that with the databases, as far as being able to find Black therapists, it's set up to where you can put in your zip code and find those therapists that are nearest you, that are competent and culturally aware to be able to assist. They also put their photos, and that's one of the things that most of us we do when we apply to these particular databases. We put a photo in our demographics and our background so folks can see what's our training, what's our background, what do we look like, and clients self-select us to be able to say, there's someone that I can work with. As a side note, I have a private practice, and I have people that drive from Maryland all the way to Virginia to find me. So there are folks that are out there looking and not just staying within their own community. So we'll make sure we get you those a list of those different organizations so you all can post them. You can get online and find them, and once you get on there, it's like in the privacy of your own home, you can also find them. The beauty is when you know of someone that could use their help, you can also find therapists for them as well.
And I just add that a number of therapists now are doing telehealth, and a number of states have loosened the rules regarding telehealth. So that if you have COVID concerns, you can be seen over your tablet or over your computer. And one other thing, this should not this may not be our audience, but if for some reason you don't have insurance, or you're getting paid by a 1099, then and you need to find a place, look at the universities in your city, because many of them are training therapists, and so they have clinics where they see people either for free or with a sliding scale, and you're being seen by a graduate student, but they're being supervised by a licensed therapist like Dr. Dave or myself.
I'm so glad you mentioned that, because I say that quite frequently, because you're getting the best of both worlds. You're getting the latest research and you're getting the oversight of a seasoned clinician.
Excellent. Again, on behalf of the National Bar Association, I want to thank both of you for just an outstanding presentation. You not only diagnosed the problem that many African Americans face, you provided a number of resources that are available in terms of finding mental health professionals that are culturally sensitive, and we also pointed out to resources that you can look at as well. So again, on behalf of the National Bar Association, I want to thank you, Dr. Angela, for all that you do, and also Dr. Jenkins, I want to thank you as well. And also I want to thank our president, C.K. Hoffler, and also our great MBA staff. I just want to put in a word that this is the first of our mental health wellness series, and it's in conjunction with the COVID task force that I'm helping to lead with Karen Evans and Laverne Largy. The next segment of the wellness series is dealing with the issue of remote education, and that particular webinar is going to be on November 10th, 2020 at 12:30 to 2, and it's understanding remote education, which can also cause a lot of stressors for those that have children at home. And that is going to feature Dr. Gregory Hutchins, who's a superintendent in Alexandria, Virginia, Dr. Ralph Sampson, who's a superintendent in Clayton County Schools in Georgia, my wife, Kathy Howard Primes, who's a proprietor of Momentum Tutoring, Jamila Fair, who's an attorney in the Atlanta area. So we look forward to that program and many others in this series. Again, thank you for participating in the program today, our wonderful speakers, and also I want to thank all of our participants as well. Again, thank you, and have a good rest of the day and good rest of the week. Thank you. God bless.